Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to help you navigate complex research, pulling out the key insights so you don't have to sift through dense academic papers yourself.
And today, we're diving into something really fundamental. It's about how we manage our oceans, our relationship with them. The old ways aren't cutting it anymore. We need a rethink.
Definitely. This deep dive is centered on a really influential review article. It's called Ecosystem-Based Marine Spatial Management: Review of Concepts, Policies, Tools, and Critical Issues. The lead author is Katsanevakis, and it was published back in 2011 in Ocean and Coastal Management.
Yeah, and it's critical because it really marked a shift, didn't it? Moving from just talking about these big ideas to figuring out, okay, how do we actually do this? How do we put it into practice?
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack this emerging idea, ecosystem-based marine spatial management, or EBMSM. We need to understand what it is, why we need it, what drives it legally.
And then really get into the nuts and bolts, the tools, the planning stuff, how we monitor the tricky socioeconomic side of things, all the practical stuff needed to make this integrated vision actually work out there on the water.
Okay, let's tackle that core conflict head on. The paper argues pretty strongly that the way we've usually managed oceans just isn't working for sustainable development. Why is this old approach, sectoral management, so flawed?
Well, the biggest issue is fragmentation. It's like, imagine trying to run a factory by having the engine department and the assembly line department never talking to each other.
Right.
Sectoral management does that for the ocean. You've got fisheries managed by one agency, maybe shipping routes by another, pollution control somewhere else.
Each with its own rules, its own little patch.
Exactly. Own rules, often own goals, sometimes conflicting goals. It breeds competition, not cooperation.
Yeah.
You manage one slice, ignoring the whole picture.
So you might say, ban fishing in one spot to protect spawning fish. But if you don't also consider the heavy ship traffic nearby or maybe dredging impacts, you haven't really protected the whole ecosystem that relies on that spot. It's piecemeal.
That's the word the paper uses, piecemeal governance. And the big failure, Katsanevakis and the team point out, is that this approach completely misses the cumulative impacts.
Ah, right, the combined effect.
Yeah. You might assess the impact of, I don't know, one wind turbine, but what about 10 turbines, plus more ships, plus runoff from coastal farms, all hitting the same area? The ecosystem feels all of that together.
And the paper paints a pretty stark picture of that burden. It says basically no part of the ocean is untouched by us anymore.
It's quite sobering, yeah. That realization is what's driving this need for a new approach. We depend on the oceans for so much food, medicine, climate regulation, coastal defense. Huge economic value.
Billions, easily.
Trillions, globally, if you believe some estimates. But our use has led to massive habitat degradation, resources being depleted, biodiversity loss. It's across the board.
And on top of the degradation, there's just the fight for space, right? It's getting crowded. What are the main things competing for room out there? It's not just fishing boats versus other fishing boats anymore.
No, not at all. It's incredibly crowded. You've got your traditional uses like fishing and shipping lanes. But now they're competing head-to-head with booming new sectors. Think marine aquaculture fish farms. Offshore oil and gas exploration is still huge. Dredging for sand and gravel for construction.
And the big one, renewables.
Exactly. Especially the massive space needed for offshore wind farms, potentially tidal energy installations too. These things take up enormous areas.
So it's not just about protecting nature from people, it's about managing conflicts between different groups of people and also between all those users and the health of the ocean itself. Which brings us to the solution they propose. EBMSM. Moving from managing bits and pieces to managing the whole system.
Right. EBMSM is designed specifically to tackle those failures. It's an approach that looks at the full array of interactions happening in a marine ecosystem. And critically, that includes us, humans in all our activities.
So it's not just about fish or coral reefs in isolation?
No. It moves beyond single species, single problems, single services. It looks at the whole interconnected web.
And the big picture goal. What does success look like for EBMSM?
The paper frames it clearly. Maintain marine ecosystems in a healthy, productive, and resilient condition. Resilience is the key word there.
Able to bounce back.
Yeah, able to withstand pressures and changes so they can keep providing the goods and services we need and support sustainable human use long term. And, the real contribution of this Katsanevakis review, as they say themselves, is focusing on the tools. How do we actually do MSP? How do we value things? How do we adapt? It bridges that gap from theory to practice.
Okay, but before we get into those tools, If sectoral management was, let's face it, probably simpler politically, deal with fisheries here, shipping there, what's the big risk in adopting something as complex and holistic as EBMSM?
That's a really important point. The risk is getting bogged down. Political paralysis.
Too complicated, too many arguments.
Exactly. Sectoral management might fail ecologically, but it can seem politically easier sometimes. EBMSM demands integration, getting all the stakeholders around the table, working across different government departments, maybe even across national borders. It risks becoming so complex, so politically charged, that nothing actually happens. It fails by just stalling.
Which is why having solid tools and a clear process is so vital.
Absolutely. Robust planning, active stakeholder buy-in, ways to manage that complexity are essential. Otherwise, it's just a nice idea on paper. Hashtag take two. From high goals to actionable objective.
Right, so if the big goal is healthy, resilient oceans, well, that sounds great, but you can't exactly tell a fisheries manager, go make the ocean healthy. How does the paper say we get from that big societal value down to something concrete, something you can actually manage and measure?
It lays out a clear hierarchy. You start with those high-level goals, what society wants from its oceans. Then, policymakers and scientists have the tough job of translating those into operational objectives. Only then can you figure out specific targets and actions, like setting a catch limit or drawing a line for a protected zone.
And as soon as you have an objective, you need to know if you're hitting it. That's where those famous criteria come, in the SMART criteria. Seems basic, but so many plans fail because they don't meet these, right?
Absolutely. A vague or unmeasurable objective is useless for management. You can't track progress, you can't allocate resources effectively, you can't hold anyone accountable, so objectives have to be SMART.
Let's break that down. SMART, what's the S?
Specific. The goal needs to be crystal clear, no ambiguity. Improve fish stocks is way too fuzzy. A specific objective might be increase the spawning biomass of cod in Area X by 20% over 5 years. See? Very clear. Measurable. It has to relate to something you can actually measure, whether it's fish numbers, habitat size, water quality, something quantifiable. This allows you to set indicators and check if you're getting there. If you can't monitor it affordably, it's not a useful objective.
Makes sense.
Achievable. This one's crucial. All the objectives in your plan have to be possible together. They can't fundamentally contradict each other.
Like wanting maximum wind energy and zero impact on marine mammals in the same spot.
Exactly. If objectives clash like that, you have to explicitly acknowledge the trade-offs and decide how to balance them. They aren't achievable simultaneously without that.
Okay.
Realistic. This is about resources. Is the objective feasible, given the money, the staff, the technology, the research capacity you actually have? And critically, can you enforce it? Setting a rule you can't possibly enforce is pointless.
Like needing 2047 satellite surveillance when you can only afford a boat patrol once a month.
Precisely. And finally, T.
Time-bound.
Time-bound. There has to be a deadline, a clear timescale. By 2030, within the next decade, this creates milestones accountability. If any one of these SMART elements is missing, the objective kind of falls apart scientifically and politically.
Okay, so that's the ideal. But we're not starting from zero here. The paper mentions international agreements that already push for this kind of integrated thinking.
Yeah, the groundwork has been laid over decades. You've got UNCLS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is like the Constitution for the Oceans, covering jurisdiction, environment, everything. Then there's the CBD Convention on Biological Diversity. That requires countries to set up protected areas and think about biodiversity in all their planning.
And Agenda 21 from the Rio Earth Summit back in '92.
Right. That pushed for integrated coastal and ocean management, specifically mentioning the ecosystem approach and impact assessments for big projects. Plus, things like the FAO's Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, these provide the international legal backbone.
But the paper also flags a big problem here, right? Even with these agreements.
Yeah, institutional fragmentation is still a massive issue. And it gets even worse when you talk about the high seas, areas beyond national control. Who manages that comprehensively? It's incredibly difficult to enforce anything out there.
Okay, let's bring it closer to home with a regional example the authors use. The EU's Marine Strategy Framework Directive, the MSFD. How did that turn these big ideas into something more concrete?
The MSFD is basically the EU's rulebook for getting its marine waters into good environmental status, or GES. And Annex 1 of the directive is key. It lists 11 qualitative descriptors of what GES actually looks like. These act as those high-level but specific goals for EBMSM in Europe.
11 descriptors. Can you give us a feel for some of them, especially the ones that show how holistic this thinking is?
Sure, they really cover the gamut: biology, chemistry, physics. You've got expected ones like maintaining biological diversity, keeping fish stocks within safe limits, ensuring food webs are functioning properly.
The basics of a healthy ecosystem.
Right. But then it goes further. It includes things like minimizing human-caused eutrophication, that's nutrient pollution, making sure contaminants aren't causing pollution effects, protecting the seafloor's integrity.
Okay, so physical structure too.
Yeah. And maybe one of the most forward-looking ones, because it's relatively new and hard to tackle, is about energy inputs, specifically ensuring that underwater noise is kept at levels that don't harm marine life.
Wow, noise. That really shows the scope, doesn't it? Shipping, construction noise, seismic surveys for oil and gas.
All of it. Managing noise pollution means you're managing the whole sensory environment for marine animals, not just the water chemistry or fish populations. And just figuring out how to measure noise levels across a whole sea is a massive challenge itself. Needs new tech, big resources. It shows how deep EBMSM aims to go.
Okay, so we've got the goals, make them smart, aim for something like good environmental status. Now, how do we actually map those goals onto the ocean and regulate what happens where? The paper really digs into three main tools: marine spatial planning, ocean zoning, and marine protected areas. Let's start with marine spatial planning, MSP. The paper calls this the essential foundation. So what is it, fundamentally, this public process?
Think of MSP as the master plan, the strategic framework for the sea. It's often described as city planning for the ocean.
Okay, I like that analogy.
It's a public process that's important for analyzing and deciding how to allocate human activities across space and time. Where should things happen? When? How? All aimed at achieving those ecological, economic, and social goals we talked about.
So it's the big picture plan. And like any good city plan, it can't just be lines drawn on a map randomly. What principles does it need to be built on?
Good MSP has to be grounded in solid ecological understanding. Things like protecting native species diversity, maintaining different types of habitats, that heterogeneity, ensuring connectivity so animals can move between areas.
Like wildlife corridors, but underwater.
Exactly. And crucially, MSP needs clear targets for these ecological features. Plus, it has to grapple with uncertainty, acknowledging what we don't know and planning for it. The paper mentions practical guides exist, like one from UNESCO, laying out steps to make MSP actually happen. So it's becoming a defined process.
But the moment you start saying, okay, maybe a wind farm goes here, but the fishing ground is over there, and the shipping lane runs next to it, that's when the arguments start, right? The paper hammers home this stakeholder imperative. How do you get everyone involved effectively?
It's absolutely critical, and the key, the paper stresses, is early and meaningful involvement. Stakeholders, fishing communities, industry groups, tourism operators, conservation NGOs, local communities, they need to be involved in actually developing the plan, shaping the framework.
Not just shown a finished map and ask for comments.
Precisely. If they're only consulted at the end, it feels like a top-down command and control exercise. That breeds resentment, makes enforcement way harder and more expensive down the line. Getting buy-in early is essential for the plan to stick.
Okay, so you have the MSP, the big integrated plan developed with stakeholders. How do you translate that plan into actual rules on the water? That sounds like ocean zoning, or OZ.
That's exactly it. Ocean zoning is the regulatory toolkit to implement the MSP. If MSP is the strategy document, OZ is the rulebook applied to different areas on the map. It divides the region into different zones.
Like different districts in a city.
Yeah, similar idea.
Yeah.
And each zone has specific rules. Certain activities might be allowed, others might be restricted, and some might be completely prohibited. All designed to make sure the overall goals of the MSP are met across the whole region.
Can you walk us through a quick example how MSP and OZ might work together?
Sure. Imagine the MSP identifies Area A as prime for renewable energy, but adjacent Area B is a critical migration route for whales.
Okay.
So the OZ would then create, say, a renewable energy zone in Area A. The rules there might allow wind turbine construction, but perhaps ban certain types of fishing, like bottom trawling, that could damage cables. Simultaneously, in Area B, it might create a marine mammal protection zone where any fixed structures are prohibited to keep the migration path clear, but maybe low-impact tourism, like whale watching, is allowed under strict conditions.
Got it. The paper mentions that the lack of clear property rights in the ocean makes this tricky, but it's possible by shifting focus to use rights in legislation. And this isn't just drawing lines anymore, is it? There's software involved.
Yeah, it's gotten much more sophisticated. The paper mentions Markson with zones as an example. This is basically optimization software.
Optimization.
It lets planners explore thousands of different possible zoning arrangements. The software tries to find options that achieve the conservation targets, like protecting, say, 20% of each key habitat type, while minimizing the negative impact on human users, the cost to industry, the social disruption. It helps find the most efficient way to achieve the goals, balancing the trade-offs.
Okay, that leads us to the third tool, marine protected areas, MPAs. Now, the paper makes a point of distinguishing these from MST, which often get confused.
Yes, this is a really important clarification. EBMSM is the whole philosophy, the big umbrella. MSP is the planning process for the entire marine area under consideration. MPAs are one specific tool used within that larger plan.
They're not the same thing.
Definitely not interchangeable. MPAs are specific areas given extra protection because they contain something special, maybe a sensitive coral reef, a vital fish nursery ground, an important seabird colony, a popular dive site. They need focused, site-specific rules, often stricter than the surrounding waters.
But the paper argues that just having a few isolated MPAs dotted around isn't enough, especially with challenges like climate change coming up. It talks about networks.
Absolutely. Ecologically coherent MPA networks are crucial for resilience. A network of connected MPAs is much stronger than the sum of its parts.
Why is that?
Several reasons. A network spreads the risk. If one MPA suffers a disaster, the species or habitat might survive in another nearby. It builds redundancy, it protects different life stages, and critically, it allows for connectivity. Larvae can drift between reserves, animals can move. This is vital for adapting to large-scale changes like warming waters. Species might need to shift their range, and a network gives them places to move to. A single, isolated MPA could just become ineffective if conditions change too much.
Okay, it feels like we've got the goals set, the legal context, the main planning tools, MSP, OZ, MPAs. But the paper is refreshingly honest here. It says, even with the best plans, we often get it wrong because ecosystems are complex and we can't predict everything perfectly. This uncertainty means we need a feedback loop.
That's the crucial insight. Historically, a lot of mismanagement happened because we treated plans as fixed, assuming the environment was stable. But ecosystems are dynamic. They respond in unexpected ways. So effective management has to involve continuous monitoring, evaluating how things are going, and then this is key, adapting the plan based on what we learn. This whole process is called adaptive management, or AM.
Let's be clear, though, adaptive management isn't just random trial and error or an excuse for managers messing up, right?
No, definitely not. It's much more structured. AM means managing according to a plan, but designing that plan so that management actions are treated like experiments or hypotheses. You deliberately learn from the results of your actions and systematically modify future decisions based on that learning.
And the paper talks about two flavors of this, passive and active.
That's right. First, there's passive adaptive management. This is where you monitor the system, and if you see something unexpected, say, fish stocks are declining faster than predicted, you reactively adjust your policies. You lower the catch limit, for example. Learning happens, but it's more of a side effect, not the main goal of the action.
Okay, so reacting to new data, what's active AM then?
Active adaptive management is more deliberate, more experimental. Here, learning is an explicit objective. When you're choosing between different management options, you actually consider how much you might learn from each one.
How would that work in practice?
You might consciously try out two different approaches in similar areas. For instance, maybe test two different types of fishing gear restrictions in two comparable zones. Then you carefully monitor the outcomes in both ecological impacts, economic impacts, specifically to figure out which approach works better. You're actively designing management to generate knowledge.
That sounds potentially more powerful for learning, but also more complex, maybe more costly. What are the pros and cons?
Active AM definitely speeds up learning and improves your ability to predict things in the future. But yes, it needs more upfront investment in designing the experiments, setting up detailed monitoring, analyzing the results. And there's always a risk that one of the experimental actions might turn out to be less effective or even slightly harmful while you're learning.
And passive AM?
Passive AM is usually cheaper and easier to implement initially, but the learning is slower, less robust. You might stick with a suboptimal approach for longer because you're not actively testing alternatives. Given how much uncertainty climate change is throwing at us, the paper seems to imply that the faster learning from active AM might be worth the extra effort, despite the challenges.
Makes sense. Now, for either type of adaptive management to work, you need good evaluation. You need to know if your actions are actually having the intended effect. How does the paper suggest we evaluate management performance?
The evaluation has to check if measures are working. Are they efficient, effective, and equitable? The paper mentions frameworks, like one by Jones from 2000, that lay out steps. It's a cycle. Define your objectives clearly. Specify what success looks like, desired outcomes. Choose indicators to track. Do the monitoring, analyze the results, report back transparently to everyone involved.
And then use that information to adjust the management plan.
Exactly. It's a continuous improvement loop. Keeps the process honest and accountable.
And that loop obviously depends heavily on the data you collect. Which brings us to indicators. What makes a good indicator for tracking progress in EBMSM?
Indicators are basically your dashboard signals. They simplify complex information into something you can track over time. A good indicator needs several qualities. It has to be readily measurable. You need to actually be able to collect the data affordably. It needs to be scientifically sound. It has to be interpretable. People need to understand what it means.
And understandable to everyone, not just scientists.
Absolutely crucial. Stakeholders, the fishers, the industry folks, the public need to understand the indicators being used and trust them. If they don't get the metric, they won't buy into the results or the management decisions based on them.
And given this is an ecosystem-based approach, the indicators can't just be about fish numbers, can they?
No way. They have to cover the whole picture. So yes, ecological indicators, things like species abundance, habitat extent, maybe indicators of food web structure, but also socioeconomic indicators, local employment in coastal communities, perhaps changes in income, levels of conflict between different user groups. And finally, governance indicators are people complying with the rules. How well is the collaborative process working? You need to track all three: ecological, social, economic, to really know if your EDMSM plan is succeeding overall.
Okay, this brings us squarely into the tricky intersection of ecology and human values. Because any management decision creating an MPA, changing fishing rules, inevitably creates winners and losers. It shifts who benefits and who bears the cost. The paper argues we need to assess these trade-offs, often using tools like cost-benefit analysis, CBA.
Exactly. The underlying idea behind using CBA here is that, ideally, good management should result in a net gain for society as a whole. But to do that calculation, you first have to try and put a value on the marine environment itself. The paper discusses this through a concept called total economic value, or TE.
TV, total economic value. What does that encompass?
TV is the standard economic framework, and it's important to note it's inherently anthropocentric. It defines value based on human utility or preference.
Right, value to us.
Yes. TE tries to capture all the value people derive from the environment. It breaks this down into market values, things easily bought and sold, and the much trickier non-market values.
How are those categories broken down further?
You have use values and non-use values. Use values come from actually interacting with the environment. Direct use is obvious: catching fish, going diving, shipping goods. Indirect use covers the ecosystem services that support those activities, like coastal protection from reefs, waste assimilation, climate regulation, stuff the ecosystem does behind the scenes.
Okay. And non-use values. These sound harder to grasp, maybe more philosophical?
They are. Non-use values are experienced passively without direct interaction. The main one is existence value. This is the value people place on simply knowing that something exists, like blue whales, or a pristine deep-sea vent community, even if they have no intention of ever seeing or using it themselves. There's also bequest value, wanting to preserve it for future generations. These are real values people hold, but they're incredibly difficult to put a price tag on.
So how do economists try to measure these non-market values, especially something like existence value, so it can be compared to, say, the market value of oil drilled from the seabed?
They use specific monetary valuation techniques. The paper outlines two main types. First, revealed preference methods, or RP. These look at people's actual behavior in related markets to infer value.
Like how much people pay to travel to a nice beach.
Exactly. The travel cost method is a classic RP example. You estimate the value of a recreational site by looking at how much time and money people actually spend to get there.
Okay, what's the second type? This sounds like the controversial one.
That would be stated preference, or SP. These methods are used when there's no market behavior to observe, like for existence value. So they create a hypothetical market and ask people directly about their values. The best-known technique is contingent valuation, CV.
Where you just ask people, how much would you pay?
Essentially, yes. You carefully construct a survey asking people their willingness to pay, WTP, for a specific environmental improvement or to prevent a specific loss. Another SP method is choice modeling, where people choose between different scenarios with varying environmental attributes and costs.
And this is where we get into the big debates mentioned in the paper, like that famous Costanza study from 1997 that put a massive dollar figure on global ecosystems.
Right, the Costanza et al. Study is a landmark, both for its ambition and the debate it sparked. They estimated the total value of the world's ecosystem services at something like $33 trillion per year back then, a staggering number. And they found marine systems were worth almost double terrestrial ones per unit area.
How did they get such a huge number? They didn't survey everyone on Earth.
No, they relied heavily on a technique called benefits transfer, or BT. This is where you take valuation results from existing studies done in specific locations.
Like the value of one particular wetland.
Exactly. You take that value per hectare and then you multiply it up to estimate the value of all similar ecosystems globally or across a large region.
And what's the problem with doing that? Why did other economists push back?
There are a few major criticisms. One is about the underlying SP methods themselves, the hypothetical bias. Asking people what they would pay isn't the same as them actually having to pay. People might inflate their answers.
Sure.
But the bigger issue with benefits transfer is the transfer itself. It assumes the value derived from one specific place, with its unique context and population, can just be averaged and applied everywhere else. It assumes these values are perfectly transferable, perfectly fungible. Many economists argue this ignores crucial local differences, and that simply adding up these transferred values doesn't give you a meaningful economic number. It's more like a thought experiment built on potentially shaky foundations.
Okay, so if putting dollar signs on everything is problematic, what are the alternatives for guiding policy decisions that involve these complex values?
The paper definitely acknowledges the need for alternatives, especially when dealing with values that aren't easily monetized, like cultural or ethical values. These are non-monetary assessments. Instead of trying to get everything into dollars, they focus on understanding trade-offs, finding areas of conflict and agreement among stakeholders.
What kind of methods are we talking about?
Things like environmental impact assessment, EIA, which catalogs potential effects. Opinion polling, OP, can gauge public preferences. And the really useful one the paper mentions is multi-criteria analysis, MCA.
MCA.
Multi-criteria analysis allows stakeholders and decision-makers to weigh different objectives against each other, maybe ecological health versus jobs versus fairness, without forcing them into a single monetary unit.
Yeah.
You can rank options based on how well they perform across multiple important criteria. It helps make the trade-offs explicit.
So what's the big takeaway from all this valuation discussion for actually implementing EBMSM?
It really underscores how vital that collaborative dimension is. Valuation isn't just a technical exercise to get a number. It's a process to understand what people value, including all those non-market and intangible aspects. If EBMSM planning ignores those core values, or if the valuation process itself isn't seen as fair and transparent, the whole thing can be perceived as just another top-down, economically driven plan.
Leading to conflict and making it harder to implement.
Exactly. You get low compliance, high enforcement costs. Using valuation tools, including non-monetary ones, to build understanding and legitimacy among stakeholders is just as important as the technical calculation itself.
Okay. Any plan for the future needs to grapple with the big disruptors. The paper highlights two critical ones that EBMSM absolutely has to address: climate change and geohazards. Let's start with climate change. The paper calls it an overriding imperative.
Yeah, you really can't plan for the ocean's future without putting climate change front and center. The impacts are already pervasive and interconnected. We're seeing rising water temperatures causing coral bleaching, shifts in fish distributions.
Fish moving poleward to cooler waters.
Exactly. We've got sea level rise threatening coasts, ocean acidification hitting shellfish and plankton at the base of the food web, increased coastal erosion. It's fundamentally changing the baseline conditions that marine ecosystems and our management plans rely on.
So if the environment itself is constantly changing, how can a planning framework like EBMSM cope? How does it build in that flexibility?
The key is that the framework can't be static. It has to be designed for change, for continuous updating. That means having clear rules for regularly reviewing and revising environmental targets. The whole adaptive management idea we discussed, monitoring, learning, adjusting, becomes absolutely essential. You can't manage for a fixed state in a changing climate.
And you mentioned MPA networks earlier. How do they fit into climate resilience specifically?
Networks are seen as a really key adaptation strategy because they spread the risk geographically and protect a wider range of conditions.
So if one area gets too warm.
Hopefully, a similar habitat in a connected, perhaps slightly cooler reserve within the network can still support the species. The recommendation is to design networks that explicitly span environmental gradients, like temperature ranges, and ensure good connectivity between reserves to act as stepping stones for species that need to shift their range.
But climate change isn't just about protecting ecosystems from impacts. It's also about managing new conflicts caused by our attempts to mitigate climate change, right?
Yeah, that's a huge emerging issue. The push for renewable energy means a massive build-out of offshore infrastructure. We're talking vast wind farms, potentially tidal energy arrays.
Taking up huge amounts of ocean space.
Exactly. And that space often overlaps with traditional fishing grounds, important shipping lanes, or areas previously earmarked for conservation. EDMSM, because it's designed to integrate all uses, is really the only framework we have that could potentially manage these intense new spatial conflicts between climate mitigation and other ocean uses.
Okay, let's turn to the second big risk factor, geohazards. These are more about sudden, sometimes catastrophic geological events.
Right. EBMSM also needs to factor in risks from the Earth itself. Things like submarine landslides, which can trigger tsunamis, earthquake effects like the seafloor suddenly rising or falling or rupturing, volcanic activity underwater, hydrothermal vents releasing fluids. These can all pose significant risks, especially in certain regions.
And management needs to plan for these. How?
It needs to be integrated into spatial planning. Identifying areas prone to these hazards is step one. Then you need mitigation strategies. This is particularly important for coastal communities and any expensive marine infrastructure, like pipelines or cables.
What's the most concerning geohazard mentioned?
The paper flags tsunamis, often triggered by those underwater landslides or earthquakes. They can have devastating impacts on shorelines. So things like accurate tsunami modeling, predicting where inundation might occur, how high the water might reach, become really important for coastal planning and evacuation routes.
And how does this geohazard risk feed into decisions within EBMSM, like where to put an MPA?
It should be part of the site selection criteria. The paper suggests that if you have two potential sites for an MPA, and they're roughly equal in ecological value, you should actively prefer the one with lower geohazard risk. Avoid putting your most protected assets in the most dangerous spots if you can.
Makes sense.
And more broadly, coastal plans developed under EBMSM need to incorporate things like buffer zones, setting buildings back from vulnerable areas, and investing in early warning systems for hazards like tsunamis or landslides. It's about building resilience to geological events too. #Tag7. Conclusions, challenges, and future research.
Okay, so pulling this all together, the review makes a compelling case that EBMSM isn't just a nice idea, it's pretty much essential if we want sustainable oceans. What's the quick summary of why it's better than the old fragmented way?
The big advantage is that integration. It's innovative because it forces a multidisciplinary view, bringing together ecological, social, economic data. It promotes learning and adaptation. It explicitly recognizes all those connections within the ecosystem, including across boundaries. And it provides practical tools, MSP, zoning, adaptive networks, to actually manage that complexity, especially in the face of huge challenges like climate change.
But it's not easy. The paper is clear about the hurdles. What are the major challenges still facing the implementation of EBMSM?
They identify some pretty significant ones. 4 main hurdles, really. First, there are still major science and knowledge gaps. We just don't fully understand things like cumulative impacts, how resilient ecosystems really are, or even basic population dynamics for many species across large areas.
So we're still learning a lot about the ocean itself.
Absolutely. Second, there are constraints in policies and laws, especially when you get beyond national waters into the high seas. There's often no single body with the authority to implement and enforce a truly comprehensive plan out there.
Right, the Wild West problem. What are the other two?
Third is institutional fragmentation. Even within countries, you still have different agencies responsible for different sectors: transport, fisheries, energy, environment, and they often don't coordinate well. They operate in silos. It makes true integration really hard in practice.
Bureaucracy gets in the way.
Pretty much. And fourth, and this is perennial, is the difficulty of aligning environmental goals with stakeholder needs and expectations. Finding solutions that protect the ecosystem and are seen as fair and viable by the people who depend on the ocean for their livelihoods or recreation. That's a constant balancing act.
So, given those challenges and knowledge gaps, where does the paper say we need more research or better guidance to really push EBMSM forward?
They pinpoint 3 key areas needing work. First, they say we need much clearer guidance on how to properly integrate socioeconomic valuation into the planning process. How do we credibly link the value of ecosystem services to the actual costs and benefits of different management options? Getting that CBA right and making it trustworthy is vital.
Okay. Second.
Related to that, the valuation techniques themselves need improvement, especially for those non-market values. We need more robust, less controversial methods that can genuinely help guide complex policy decisions involving difficult trade-offs.
And the third area for future work sounds like it relates back to uncertainty.
It does. The final point is a need for practical guidance on how to assess the risks and consequences of different future scenarios. How do managers weigh up options when they have to account for natural fluctuations, plus climate change impacts, plus potential geohazards, all at the same time? Developing tools to help managers navigate that combined uncertainty is the ultimate challenge.
So it really feels like a shift from trying to manage for predictable outcome to managing for learning and adaptation in an unpredictable world. EBMSM gives us the framework, MSP the process, but it's that adaptive management mindset that has to drive it, accepting we don't have all the answers up front.
It really is a profound shift in thinking. And it raises some big questions, given these acknowledged limits to our knowledge and the huge uncertainty from climate change forcing us to be constantly flexible. How does this need for active adaptive management change the fundamental role of scientists and managers? Are they becoming less like definitive experts and more like facilitators of learning? And what responsibility does that shift where management actions are essentially experiments placed on all the stakeholders? Do we all need to be more willing to accept uncertainty, participate transparently in the learning process, and maybe share the risks involved in trying new approaches?
That's a really powerful thought to end on. It's not just about managing fish anymore. It's about managing our own learning process in the face of change. We hope this deep dive has given you a solid understanding of EBMSM and the complex but crucial task of governing our oceans. Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time.